having discussed some general threads of thought or coming up with very broad ideas, I now want to shift to using arrangement as a way of prompting invention. And invention and arrangements are sort of an interesting relationship. Generally, we kind of talk about thinking through arrangement before we get too deep in thinking through invention before we get too deep into arrangement. And as I said last time, I don't want to put the cart before the horse here, but I really do think that arrangement can help invention, and it can help you think through a subject for an audience and see and identify where you need to help the audience maybe a little bit more or maybe a little bit less. And it just gives you a sense of what this would look like when test run. And so arrangement allows you to sort of dial in what you want to speak to. So this kind of bridges the gap between invention and arrangement. This is useful for arrangement, but what I'm going to talk about I think is also very useful for helping you figure out what you want to speak on. So in this lecture, I want to talk about some very general, very broad patterns of arrangement, and then I want to talk to some sort of genre-specific ones, because the more detailed you get, you're finding more models of imitation, and you're expanding your speech repertoire. And so you're going to be better when it comes to judging which one to use and which one not to use. So in terms of general patterns, you pick up any book on public speaking in the past 100 years, and you're probably going to find some of these general patterns of public speaking. And there are traces of these through time. So we can talk about organizing the speech chronologically. So let's say at your work you need to give a project update, and to the rest of the office or the division, and basically it's just I want to talk a little bit about what our team was working, what our team was assigned to do, some of the stuff we did, where we are now, where we're going to be going in the next 3 months, right? So it's you're organizing the speech chronologically. What we're getting is the narrative of your product, the narrative of your teamwork. You could actually just straight up organize a speech as a narrative. So if you watch any show that's a travel log, some of those shows, if they're filmed, they're going to be spatially organized. And a speech can be spatially organized. Here are the key features. But they're also sometimes organized as narratives. I landed, and then we went to the hotel and had a delightful brunch, and the bread and breakfast was super, and then so on and so forth. So it's going to be the narrative of that author, the narrative of that speaker. As I mentioned, spatial. Spatial is another clearly obvious way of organizing information if you're talking about features that exist in three-dimensional space. Two-dimensional space as well, I suppose. So let's say you're doing a speech, on the geographic features of Mars, and you're like, here, if you were standing on the top of Olympus Mons, to your right you would see this, in front of you would see this, and then far beyond you on the left you would see that, where each one of those would be an interesting feature. So, that makes sense that you could organize your presentation in that way. So chronological, narrative, spatial, these are very broad ways of thinking about how you might choose to organize that information. But what I'd like to do is give you a couple of very specific patterns, not because these are only useful for the genres that I'm indicating, but because understanding how you might make a specific choice is helpful. So I've mentioned a couple of times I run a speeching center. We work on mispronouncing things. We're at the forefront of our field. I run a speaking center where people tutor speakers. So they come in, they provide one-on-one feedback. We record them. It's a nice sort of consulting service. Students are doing it for students, and what the tutors get out of it is so much when it comes to developing their speech ability, because they are now seeing all sorts of different types of arrangement patterns, all sorts of different types of evidence use, much more than they would see if they themselves just did it. So I want to move through some very specific responses to genre concerns so that it might help you figure out what you would want to do. Or you might get an idea from one and combine it with an idea from another. All of these are just potential things that you can use in arranging your speech. The goal here is clarity, and the speech should make sense, but here are some possible things. So I know a number of people in the class, and I know in general people are concerned with presenting research. This is a key issue for scientists, and I will spend time working with scientists, and one way of organizing that presentation, this would certainly be the case if you're at a conference, is organizing the presentation almost as you would organize a scientific research paper. So you start off with a general orientation. You maybe talk about your recent work that your lab does or you do. Then you would walk us through the procedure, the setup of your study. Get us into the findings, talk us through some of the discussion points associated with those findings, walk us through a couple of the implications, and then wrap up. Okay, that makes sense. That's borrowing the research paper format and replicating it in a speech form. You don't want to read the exact same thing, but these are important things for other scientists to know. How did you set up your study? I want to know the findings before I want to hear your discussion. Now that makes sense for an audience of other experts. Let's say you're a scientist or a researcher and you're presenting your findings for a lay public or sometimes for a local government, right? They want to know if they're going to make policy decisions, they want to know about your research and its implications. Well, then you're probably not walking them through the research study, but you would go through and say, well, okay, introduction, here's my area of research, the general field, what I'm working on. Here's some of the recent discoveries, and then here are the implications. Because if they're making policy, those implications are what they're concerned with. They want to know how you got there, but those implications are the deliverable. That's what they're interested in. So you would work through the exact same information in two very different sort of arrangement patterns. If you are in sales and you're engaging in product description, so you're talking to your client and you're just giving them an update on how this product is different from the one that you had 2 years ago. So maybe you would talk about, well, here's some of the remaining functions from the old version, and here's some new features. Pretty straightforward. Well, you could even break that second point into two divisions. If there's a whole bunch of new features, well, you don't want to have one point that's massively long, has 18 subpoints. So be thinking about, well, how can I break that apart? Maybe you say, here's some of the remaining features. Here's some of the new hardware features, 3, however many. Here's some of the new software features. So you took that second point and you just broke it apart based on division. It's topical ordering. Certainly, there are lots of times when you need to explain new policy. In education, we need to do this a lot. I do policy here as well, and so I often have to make new policy and then explain that new policy. And this is not an uncommon workplace event. So how would you go about doing that? Well, you could maybe spend a point talking about, well, here's why we need the policy. And then go through, well, so here's what's new about the policy. So here's our need. Here are the changes that are going to be made. Here's how our new policy solves the problems that we laid out. We'll come back to this under the issue of argument congruency in the persuasive speech. It would be really helpful if you could say, there was a need, and our new policy solves that need, and really showing the interrelationship between need and solution, problem and solution. So you can say, well, here's a need, here's what the new policy is, here's how the new policy solves for that need, and here's what we need to do next in terms of implementation of that policy. And also in those exact same settings, you might find yourself giving a budget update. So here's what the previous budget was, here were the happy things, here were the frowny face things, here's our current income, here's our current expenditures, and here are our existing areas of concern, or things we need to figure out. Here are our potential frowny faces. If you're teaching, you are doing informative speaking each and every day. And so, often we'll look at this as saying, okay, what's the chunk that you're doing? What's the specific issue that you're explaining? So you want to explain a concept, then maybe show an example of the concept, and then evaluate something, and maybe evaluate the example in terms of the concept that you introduced. That's kind of got a nice coherency. It's a nice chunk. Well, that makes sense as a standalone lesson. If you're teaching an hour-long class, usually it's an introduction, 3 of those discrete chunks, and a conclusion. Opening, here's what we're talking about today, and here's why it matters. Concept 1, explanation, example, some sort of activity or application. Concept 2, concept 3, wash and repeat as often as necessary, and then you wrap it up and tie it to the next class. So that's a way of organizing even an hour, where probably each one of those points is, it varies in length, but they're going to be somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes. Opening and conclusion is going to be less. So those are just some potential ways of organizing an informative speech. These are just guides. Everything that you come up with is going to need tailoring for your specific topic, for you as a speaker, and for your audience. And this issue of tailoring, of dialing it in, of getting the fit just right, is going to be the subject of our next discussion, our next video lecture. remember, this week is about moving from the general idea to the specific outline. And so we're kind of getting in the middle of that. And what I would like you to do now, at the end of this lecture, before you move on to the next one, I want you to draft up an outline of your key points. We've been talking about coming up with ideas and the main points and arranging those main points. Do that now. And this can be a presentation that you're going to give at the end of the week or next month, or the next presentation that you have to give that's informative in scope. What a great opportunity to spend a little time in advance thinking about it, planning it out. This is what this class should be, providing some type of advice for the very types of speeches you're finding yourself delivering each and every day. You can also use this as the opportunity to, if you're going to upload an informative speech, get to work on that. Map out that informative speech for this class. But what I want you to do now is, on your computer, on your phone, on a sheet of paper. I realized a couple of weeks ago all the examples I gave were on the bus. I assumed everybody on this class was on a bus at the same time. I'm assuming that's no longer the case anymore. But I just want you to sit down and draft out what are my main points. Maybe even thinking about what are the sub-points. But what are the main chunks of my presentation? Think back to the goals for this. Think back to what are the audience concerns, what don't they understand, and just start mapping out that informative response to the questions that your audience may have.